All right, so as we have on the screen here, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Roman first century world and the Apostle Paul in very general terms, broad kind of outline things, in preparation for starting this next week into Galatians, from where we will go to Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and then Philemon. So we got a number of things coming up here that are going to take a while that all involve a lot of these kinds of things. I'm going to be doing the first part, and Al's going to do the second one. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No.
Okay. All right. So we're going to get going. The first century Roman world, I think it's important that before we start anything, we should pray a little bit. But when we jump into the New Testament, or any part of the things surrounded that, there really is a reach for us to have to go. It's really not our world. And so, it helps, I think, to understand some of the background, some of the things, why people do things, why things are done. And so that's really what we're trying to accomplish today, so this evening. Anyhow, so let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the opportunity that we have, the freedoms we have to get into it, to talk about these things, to share the backgrounds of your gospel, your good news. And I just pray that you'll be with us this evening, with everybody here as they listen, with Al and I as we present. And we just really want it to be to your glory. Amen. Okay, so we start with this first century world with the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was not the Roman Empire always. It started out as a Roman Republic, and then about the time of Julius Caesar, most people have heard of Julius Caesar, he turned it into an empire. Now, his successor, Augustus, is the one that really began to settle things in. And so this map represents the beginning with Augustus and moving on through into the next century, kind of what happened in Rome, how it grew in terms of expansion. But the biggest part that's important for the New Testament, in particular, in the Gospel, is what was initiated with the rule of Augustus was the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, or the Roman peace. Now, this was not a time that was literally peace, in a perfect sense, without anything else going on. There were lots of wars that the Romans fought. They fought 3 against the Jews. They fought 2 against the Parthians. They fought a whole handful of them against the Germanic tribes and the Dacians along the Rhine and the Danube rivers. So there was lots of this kind of thing going on. But within the empire itself, there was an unprecedented level of peace and freedom of travel and moving about the Mediterranean basin. Now, what better time, the fullness of time, as we'll learn in Galatians, that Christ comes for the gospel to spread. And I think it's important that we see the timing of that, because after the Roman Empire fell, and after it became more turbulent, even 200 or 300 years after the New Testament, you didn't have those things, but the church was already established. And so there's, I think, an important element there that we need to appreciate about this, that there was a way of taking the gospel beyond Jerusalem and Judea as Jesus commanded. Now, this empire then, how did they get out there? How did they go about getting this gospel out? Well, there are 2 main ways they did this. The travel was primarily by roads or a cargo ship. Now, the spaghetti you see on the map there of the Mediterranean basin are the Roman road system. Most people traveled either by foot or by cargo ship. They didn't have passenger ships. But by foot, a person could get probably, or a group of people, 15 to 20 miles a day on paved roads, all-weather roads that the Romans had installed. They were famous for that. These roads still exist. You can still see them. And so they really knew how to build things. It wasn't perfectly say if it went like traveling the interstate or something today, there were some, it was arduous in places. There was some dangers associated, particularly between populated areas where, you could run into bandits, you could run into some other issues, weather conditions. But the road itself and the paths that connected all these things and the roads that fed into it from all over the empire is what gave people pretty much a freedom to get from one end of the empire to the other with relative safety for the time. Now the other way that you could travel was by ship. Now like I said, there weren't passenger ships, just cargo ships. But there was lots of shipping that went on in this area along the coast primarily, in not just the Mediterranean, but the Aegean Sea and the Adriatic Sea, and all through that. A ship with good winds could cover 100 miles in a day. Now, if you're going the other direction, it didn't go quite as fast. We see this actually in Acts chapter 16. We see them traveling from Neapolis to Troas, or one way or the other, I can't remember now. Anyway, and that took 2 days. Coming back, it took 5. And so, it was a little bit, it had its downside too. Other things that were involved with traveling by ship is it was a little more dangerous in the sense that there was possibility of storms, there was some piracy that was going on, although the Roman military cracked down on that pretty well by this time. And there was a period of time between October and May that the storms in the Mediterranean were so hostile that they didn't even get on a ship. Nothing happened during that time. So, but there was these two methods of getting around, and this is really the path the gospel took. Out from Palestine, out into Asia Minor, then into Europe. And we know that before the end of the 2nd century, you found the Christian church and Christianity all through Southern Europe, all through Northern Africa, all through Asia Minor, and it was spreading from there. So this is a very important time period that we're looking at. This all took place in a structured society, Roman society, that had been kind of imposed by this empire on the rest of the culture in this time. Had some real different statuses to it, some things that you had to deal with. The social order was well established. It started at the bottom with the slaves. Now, slaves could be found performing menial tasks in households. They could be pressed into hard labor to build big public monuments and things like that. In fact, a lot of the prisoners captured after the sack of Jerusalem, the Jews, were taken to Rome and pressed into building the Colosseum. So, that could be one of their fates. But they could also be in the government bureaucracy, and they could be teachers at prestigious schools. So the point here is that slavery was not just this very segregated, in the sense that we saw slavery in this country, for example, to one sort of type of life. It was spread all throughout the society. It's estimated that in Italy, during the middle of the 1st century, that probably one slave for every free people. When you got into some of these big estates, they could have hundreds of slaves. And Rome, during this time, it's estimated probably had a population of upward of 30-40% of the Roman population was slaves. But they were in all kinds of places, all kinds of activities all through this. So it was a different kind of slavery than we think of it, or have learned to think of it in our world. How did you become a slave? Well, the fastest way was to be born to slave parents. That pretty much sets you in that one. But also to be captured, as I mentioned, in war. It was possible for people, sometimes because of a debt, you got sold into slavery. It was very common in Roman culture particularly, and Greek culture to a certain extent, to take unwanted children and just expose them, particularly girls, babies. And people would go and collect them and raise them and then sell them as slaves. Now, the church eventually began adopting those kids, which made a really huge impact on the society at the time. But that's another way you could find yourself in slavery. Now, it wasn't permanent. Slavery wasn't necessarily permanent. There were several paths to manumission or freedom from slavery. One of them was just some exemplary service of some kind. Sometimes slaves would be freed just because they did such a good job. Their masters would free them from their slavery. A slave could buy their freedom. They could, save up a little bit here, save up a little bit there, and could possibly buy their freedom as well. Sometimes a master had lots of slaves, a household, he would just free a few of them just to kind of show how wealthy he was. It's like throwing out money to people, So you had all kinds of ways that people could get out of slavery, and when they began to get into that category, they became libertini, freed men and freed women. That's what that means in Latin. Now, once you got to that point, you went from a slave, you went to a libertini, but that didn't actually take away completely your status as a former slave. And even though you were free now in the society, you were never at the same level in society as the freeborn. And so there's this very stratified kind of society that we had here. The freeborn are in a couple different categories here. Major categories. The honestiores were the people who had honor and virtue. They were generally the more higher places in society, what we might call the aristocracy of some kind. They were in three different categories in the Roman world. They were senators, or equestrians, or decurions. Now the senators, most people know a little bit about the Roman Senate. After, it was very important in the government of the Republic of Rome, but after Julius Caesar and Augustus, it just pretty much became a social club for the aristocracy, the top of the aristocracy. The equestrians were the people that filled a lot of the high-level administrative and military positions in the society, in the Roman world. And the decurions were the ones who were maybe not quite so high positions. In Romans 16, we find mention of a guy named Erastus, who was a companion of Paul's at times, and he was the treasurer or city manager of Corinth. He was probably a decurion in terms of his status in the society. So I think it's important that you begin to see these structures, because they didn't have this transferring, going back and forth between the things that were going on, like we have this mobility in the world that we live in. There was no mobility. Once you were in these groups, that's where you stayed. Like I said, even if you went from a slave to a libertini, you still had that hanging over you that you were a slave at one time. The humiliores was the next group. These were freeborn people, and they were the ones who really had they were the small farmers, the small businessmen, the artisans, the money lenders, the winemakers. Basically, they did all that other stuff. Humiliores means of a lesser virtue or honor. Not deplorables, no, not quite deplorables, but pretty close, depending on who you were, when you were looking at them. But they were not considered virtuous by their position, like the honestiores were. So the significance of this is that, I think for us to understand, is that the early church was primarily made up of humiliores, libertini, and slaves. You had very few people from the other strata of society. And there were some, Erastus, good example of that, but it wasn't common. The majority of them were in these groups. So when you see the contemporary criticisms of these kind of people who are joining this crazy group, these Christian types out here, this is where they were attached to this group, this strata in society. So that was one of the reasons why they were kind of looked down upon.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Were soldiers slaves?
Who?
The soldiers.
The soldiers? No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The soldiers were mostly humiliores.
Oh, okay.
So now the officers weren't.
Yes.
They came from the other classes, the equestrians, decurions. Okay, good question. Meant to mention that. Now, within this whole structure of things, one of the really cores of both Greek and Roman society, and any society during this time, was the family. And the family became the foundation for the rest of the cultural values that we'll be kind of attaching to the world that is here too. The family, in the Roman structure of things, was built around a very top-down kind of thing, where the father or the primary male in a family group or a kinship group was the paterfamilias. He was the father of everybody. He had authority over everybody, over his spouse, over his kids, over the slaves, over the extended family. He had complete control over the finances and the property. He could decide who married who. He could, if a child was born to his wife that he didn't want, he was the one that would have her exposed or have him exposed. And even when the children moved out of the house in their own families, they were still under his authority. So this is a very, very top-down kind of patriarchal structure that you had in this society. Wives were expected to obey their husbands, to manage their households well, to be faithful, to worship her husband's gods. This became a challenge for Christians eventually, as women become Christians, and maybe they were married to men who were not. This is one of the problems they had to deal with, had to wrestle with. But during this time, during the first century, interestingly enough, there emerged what was called the new woman, quote unquote. And these were women primarily, initially, of wealth and standing in society, whose husbands were away at war or away on administrative trips or business trips of various kinds, all kinds of duties. And they began to exercise a lot more within the society, both in finances, in politics, even in sexuality and sexual mores changed during this time because of these women. So you had this loosening kind of going on at the same time. You had this original traditional family structure. Now, I think it's interesting when you understand that, how the New Testament discussion of families finds a path between those two. You had the traditional roles that were talked about, of course, but we also see that the foundation of the husband's position is no longer absolute authority. Ephesians 5 tells us that husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. You see more women involved in the ministries in the church, companions of Paul or patrons of Paul. So these were things that, interestingly, you see this going on, parallel that the church is forming at this time. The differences in family structures and relationships in different parts of the empire did happen. You did have different regions where you had ethnic groups that had maybe a little different practices. The Jews are a great example of that. Not only Palestine, but all throughout the Mediterranean world, they maintained their same traditions. They were very, very good. They're still very good at that. They have been historically. And so there was a little different kind of look to their family structures and things. The family was the foundation of the cultural values we can really get into that become important in the first century, and they're important in the New Testament. There's a great book, if you ever want to get into it, by David De Silva called Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity. And he spends just this whole book talking about how those values reflected in the first century culture and in the church and the differences that it made. We won't talk about every one of these things, but I do want to talk about a few key points of it. First one is kinship. Both Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3 include substantial passages on household relationships and social arrangements and, the relationships between slaves and masters. So that was something that we see talked about there. But the kinship of the extended family really formed the foundation for the group identity. The group identity is very important in first century world. There is no individualism as we know it today. A person's identity is whatever group they belong to. And they required contact and presence with this group for their social identity to mean anything. The group had distinct, unique characteristics, which the member became a representative. And when you met that one person, you met the whole group in that sense. Relations with those outside the group were strictly impersonal and sometimes hostile. Now, does any of this sound familiar? I think it's been intriguing to me that the press for identity politics that Marty talked about and we learned about last week includes some of those very characteristics, and it is put forth as something progressive, but it's actually about 2,000 years old. So the church, in Paul's teaching particularly, challenged these established group activities. He argued that followers of Jesus constituted a new people in which the old attachments and social barriers no longer mattered. And so you have passages like in Galatians 3, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Or Colossians 3, in the church there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all in all. And so I think because of some of these modern contemporary things going on, there's a place for us as the church to be sure we don't fall into that, because when we do so, we're basically disobeying New Testament commands. Patronage was another important thing. Almost all commercial, social, and even government relationships in the first century Mediterranean world were patron-client relationships. Now what that meant is that the patron, who is a person of status, would be the person that you would go to or you'd want to become friends with in order to have some patronage that was involved, maybe acquiring access to goods of some kind, protection, opportunities to advance, or jobs. You had to have those relationships in place for that to happen. The giving and receiving of favors to bring these things about, we think of that as sort of corrupt or graft or whatever, but that was part of the society. In fact, the contemporary writer Seneca commented that it's the practice that constitutes the chief bond of human society during this time. So we have, again, there's this very different kind of world than we're used to. Jesus recognized patronage when he talked about to his disciples in Luke chapter 22. He says that the kings and the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. That was the Greek word that he chose there, was the word that was used for basically patrons that contributed a lot to the civic society, either by public works or by their service of some kind. So we see that even reflected there. The short book of Philemon, at the end of all this thing we'll be doing, is a letter and it's built on a relationship between Paul and Philemon, the master of a runaway slave named Onesimus. What's interesting there is you can see the relationship, the patron-client relationship between Paul and Philemon kind of moving back and forth through even that short book, as Philemon was a patron of Paul, supporting him in his work, but Paul was a patron to the client Philemon in his spirituality. And so it helps us understand some of these relationships that we'll be looking at. Another important thing to both the Greco-Roman culture and the Jewish cultures is purity. The idea of purity. Particularly when we're talking about going into the presence of God and the presence of the divine. It's very impressive, dangerous place to go for both these cultures. The presence of God meant potential blessing, but it could mean other things as well. So you had to be careful what you were doing. And so great care was taken in the culture to be sure that you didn't bring any uncleanliness into this environment. And we see this in the Jewish world as well. Well, Jesus came along in his ministry, and what did he do with a lot of those maps and rules of the law? He began challenging some of them. And he began considering them in different ways. And so what you see in the second half of the New Testament, and this block of letters we're talking about includes a lot of this kind of material in it. You see how this church was beginning to deal with, okay, now we don't have these things in quite the same way we did before. What did the resurrection of Jesus do to change this? What happens when we're all Jew and Gentile baptized with the same Holy Spirit? And so you see a lot of that going on in the New Testament. They're still wrestling with it. The relationship between the believer and the Torah and the law is a major part of Paul's discussion in Galatians, which we'll be getting into here soon. Additionally, we see the purity theme combined with kind of the change of group identity in a passage like Ephesians 2, verse 14. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law and the commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace. So these are important themes that we see throughout these letters. Honor, I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. That's a whole topic in itself in many ways. Honor-shame societies are something that we're not very familiar with. And it's really much more important to the Gospels and understanding what's going on in them than it is to the letters, or to Paul's writings particularly. So it's not quite so critical. But a couple things that I want to mention about it. Honor in the first century Mediterranean world had nothing to do with right and wrong or good or evil. Honor was only about what in behavior could be characterized as noble or reputable or honorable, as opposed to dishonorable or shameful. It's all about your behavior. It had nothing to do with morality in that sense. And everybody in society, in this society, had attached to them from various sources an honor score, if you want to call it. I like to call it an honor score because I think of it as something kind of like a credit score in our financial world. You know, your credit score doesn't get to a point and just stay there. You know, it goes up, down, whatever you're doing, right, wrong, in between, things sometimes out of your control. The same thing happened with honor in the first century world, and honor was a key for your status in society. So I just want to say that about those things. We're not going to spend any more time on honor because, like I said, we could be here all night with that one. So,
Randy,
yes?
isn't that what's going on in China right now?
What's that?
They're keeping scores.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's a honor
That's a
score.
great example. They have what they call a social score.
Right.
Yeah. And so they score you on your how much you're doing in terms of supporting the party and supporting the environment and what's going on, what you're saying. You know, they're tracking Facebook. They have all kinds of facial recognition systems. So yeah, it's very similar to that. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about government, the governing of this New Testament world. Provinces were kind of the key to it. The provinces that you had throughout the Mediterranean world were established by Rome. They were established to help administrate this huge empire. And there were two different types. There were imperial provinces and senatorial provinces. The imperial provinces, as the word kind of says, were directly under the emperor. And these were the ones typically that were the most trouble. They are the ones who were causing trouble. Judea was always an imperial province, okay? And there were others there as well. The senatorial provinces were ones that didn't offer the same kind of threat or problems for the Roman Empire. And so places like Macedonia and Achaia were senatorial provinces. But to both of them, these were the two types that you had. And the Roman legions, which were the key to maintaining order all throughout this empire, were generally garrisoned in imperial provinces. And so you see a lot of those out on the extent of the empire because that's where they had the most trouble, is around the edges of it, and not so much in the center of it. Cities in this world, Christianity started out, in rural Galilee. That's where Jesus' ministry started. Started in kind of this, what to the Romans was something of a backwater in Palestine. But it's not long before it was primarily an urban movement. And that really just went right along with the fact that the cities were so important to the trade and the function of the Roman Empire. So the churches began to form and the people began to form in those areas. There were two types of cities. There were free cities that existed prior to the Roman occupation, and they were allowed to remain free as long as they were loyal and paid their taxes. The government and society of these cities, and examples of that are Ephesus and Tarsus and Thessalonica, were patterned after the Greek democratic city-states. That was their social and government structure within the big umbrella of the empire. The other type of city was a colony. Now, the colonies were often formed by veterans of Roman legions that had been discharged. In the 31 BC, after Augustus defeated Mark Antony and gained the sole position as the emperor, that battle was fought in the area of Philippi, and so he discharged some portion of his legions, and they formed the city of Philippi. Now, what's made that important is that all the social structures in the government in the colony were Roman in their look and their feel and how they operated. Another colony that we hear about in the New Testament is Corinth. Now, Corinth wasn't settled with discharged veterans. It was settled with libertini initially. And so, but it ran along Roman patterns rather than the Greek city-state patterns. So you had these two different kinds of things going on. And those actually come into play then as we see Paul and his movements and Acts dealing with people in these different areas and how they went about things. There were also vassal kingdoms or client states where they were alliances of some kind, but they were pretty dependent on the Roman Empire under their thumb, so to speak. There weren't so many of those, but I can pop up a map here. Just to kind of give you a sense of them, the imperial provinces are the ones in the red. You see how they're around the edges where they had the biggest problems to maintaining order. The purple were the senatorial provinces, more in the core or the center of the empire. The principal client states are in green on here. So it kind of gives you an idea of how these things laid out within the empire itself. And you see many of these places mentioned in the New Testament. You can't talk about Roman government without talking about Roman citizenship. Acquiring Roman citizenship could be done in several ways, primarily being born of citizen parents. Paul was a Roman citizen because he was born of parents who were citizens. How they got their citizenship, we're not really sure. We're not told because they weren't Roman they weren't Italian, they weren't Roman in that sense. They probably either purchased it or procured it in some way, which you could be done with just money. You could pay for a citizenship, or you could some service to the government. You could gain citizenship as well as a reward of that. Often it was accompanying manumission or freedom from slavery. Along with that, really good, well-behaved and valuable people that were freed would get citizenship along with that. Most of the Roman legions had extensive auxiliary troops who were not Italian, and when they were discharged, one of the benefits of that discharge was they got Roman citizenship. Now, they were in these auxiliaries a long time. I mean, a Roman legionnaire signed up for a 20-year hitch. So, they were similar. But the legions themselves were made up initially only of Italians and Roman citizens. Now, by the time you get to this first century that we're in right now, when we get into the New Testament, you begin to have this changing. And so by the time you get to the 2nd century AD, the majority of the legions are actually conquered peoples who have been brought into those. but they got citizenship along with some of those things. The benefits of citizenship, first and foremost, status. That was the biggest benefit. It contributed to a person's honor standing, their honor score in society if they could claim to be a Roman citizen. They had the right to vote, although by this time that didn't mean much except at the local level, because you had an imperial government. It was pretty much authoritarian. It did exclude you from humiliating punishments like crucifixion. And it also punishment, you couldn't be punished without trial. Now, when Paul and Silas went to Philippi and raised a little ruckus, they were punished without a trial. And when Paul called the attention to the fact that he was a Roman citizen in this Roman colony, whoa, that got their attention. And we'll be learning about that probably when we get to Philippians a little more. You also had the right to appeal the verdict or the outcome of a trial. That was another benefit of citizenship. And of course, Paul exercised that right after his arrest in Jerusalem and launched his nearly 6-year custody and transport to Rome for the hearing of this appeal. During that time, he was in constant company of Roman soldiers. During that time, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon were all written. And you see this reflected in some aspects of those. Paul's passage on Ephesians 6 on the armor of God probably was inspired to some extent by some additional things he learned. He'd used that illustration before in Thessalonians, but he had a little up close and personal understanding of Roman legionnaire now, and I think he probably would have benefited from that. And then also his exhortation to true citizenship in Philippians 2 is going to come from his experience and these kinds of things. I'm pausing momentarily for questions. If there aren't any, I'm just going to keep going. So,
one, Randy.
Yeah.
Back originally with the slave, how were the slaves identified, and how, like if you became a libertini after being a slave, how was that known? How would somebody on the street know that you were a slave or not a slave?
The slaves, actually, when they were slaves, unless they were in a household servant group, or if they were maybe in a work crew building a coliseum or something like that, you could tell who they were. They were the guys being whipped. But the libertini actually had a hat they had to wear, and so that identified them forever as a former slave. And actually, it would be harder to tell a slave who was in a little more prestigious position, like maybe a teacher, from a libertini by what they were wearing. So that was kind of an interesting little twist that they put in this thing. But that was most of it.
Question? Slavery, okay. Compared to America, would they be considered the same, or would they be considered different?
Well, actually the slavery in this time period is very different from anything in America in our history. Very different. Because there was no, the slavery in the United States for most of its time, the core of it was you occasionally had people who were freed and things like that, but generally they were confined to one level of society, one type of work, which is on the tobacco farms and the cotton farms, and they didn't have anything else. So it was different in that sense, because you didn't have any American slaves still in slavery teaching at Harvard or something like that. Whereas you would have the equivalent of that possibly in the first century Roman world. Aristotle was a slave. He was, in the Greek world, taken as a slave, but he also was the tutor of Alexander the Great. Lived in that world. So it was a little harder to tell from things. Okay, moving along here. One of the important elements of the first century that we need to understand is the importance of religions. Not just, Christianity came into a very pluralistic religious society. Judaism was there, of course, well established, recognized by Rome. It was throughout the empire, not just in Palestine. You had all these different enclaves throughout. In fact, there were so many Jews in Rome at one time that Claudius threw them all out because he thought they were causing trouble. And so, and you see that in the history of this time period, even as you move centuries on, where they'll be expelled for some reason by one of the emperors or somebody. So the Jews were there, and they obviously were, we see this in Acts. Paul went to the Jews first, the synagogues all throughout the Roman Empire. Another important part of the religious, practices in Rome during this time was the imperial cult. Augustus, when he became emperor, named himself the Pontifex Maximus, or the greatest priest, because he was interested in restoring and perpetuating the traditional Roman religious practices as part of becoming emperor. He also added the imperial title to the imperial titles, the Diva Filius, which is Son of God. Now, as that went forward in history, it became a very difficult situation for Christians, because who was the Son of God? Well, it wasn't whoever the emperor was at that time. And so, you have some things that happen subsequently because of that. They continued to grow that imperial cult all through the first century and on past that. It eventually established its own temples and priesthood, and those kind of things were in place by the time you had like some of the letters in Revelation were written, and you see that reflected in them. Most of the society at this time was polytheistic. And one thing you need to understand about religion is it was transactional. It was a transactional faith. In other words, you went to the gods for something and you brought something to them in order to get it. In that sense, it really was modeled after a patron-client relationship. So the god was a patron and the worshiper was the client. He was counting on that God to provide him with opportunities and things that he wouldn't have otherwise. And so you wanted to, get favorable treatment in this. You had the whole pantheon of Greek and Roman gods at play during this time period. Many cities dedicated themselves to specific deities. Ephesus is a great example of that. In the New Testament, it became the center of worship of the goddess Artemis. And Acts 19 records a riot that against the spread of the gospel, because the silversmiths were seeing it cut into their business, because they made these little statuettes and things of Artemis, and that was one of their big items for making a living. And they, to the point where we see in Acts 19:34, when they got this whole mob finally got together in one location, it said for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That's pretty radical. And so you see those kind of things happening. And there are other cities that had other gods to which they were dedicated. You also had local deities and shrines. Probably a couple of the ones that factor into the New Testament the most. One of them is actually in the Gospels, which there was a shrine to Pan and the nymphs at Paneas near Caesarea Philippi, which was part of Jesus' ministry route. In the Lycus Valley, which is where Colossae and Hierapolis and Laodicea were located, you also had a substantial temple that's been found there to the Phrygian god Men, just outside of Colossae. And Paul may have been alluding to some of the cultic practices associated with this in his warnings in Colossians when he wrote, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of this world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used according to human precepts and teachings. And so I think a lot of times when we read that, we think, well, it's probably maybe talking about the Jews. That's one of the confusions of the debates about Colossians, which maybe we'll get into some extent, I'm not sure. Anyway, superstition and magic were also very important during this time. One more thing about the polytheism. Civic events were often associated with a god or the gods. And part of being a good citizen in this time was to participate in those. Another challenge for those early Christians that were in this world. A pious pagan was not necessarily a moral person. They were a person who participated in all the right things and fulfilled the right obligations. That was another conflict between the church, because the Christian church adopted more of the Jewish idea that ethics was important, morality was important in your religion. Most of the rest of the culture, it wasn't a connection that they made. It wasn't necessary. The purpose of religion was to placate the gods. The goal of magic was to control the powers that were at work in the world. And so you had a lot of superstition and magic during this time that was prevalent throughout the first century Mediterranean world. There was widespread belief in the evil eye. That's a whole fascinating study by itself. And the efficacy of amulets and talismans. Those were common all throughout this time period. The magical arts were practiced. We have this evidence in Paul's encounters. He encountered Elymas, a magician, in Acts 13. He exorcised a spirit from a slave girl in Philippi who served her owners as a diviner or fortune teller. We see an incident in Acts 19 where the believers in Ephesus began burning their books of magic. So they began burning their books of magic as part of committing themselves to Christ. And so it was all throughout all this as well. The mystery cults are important because they promised a more personal religious experience. They often focused on just one deity. They had secret initiations and ceremonies. They weren't public like a lot of the other polytheistic practices were. They often involved imported gods that were not part of the Greek and Roman pantheons. Probably the biggest example of that, and one of the most important ones, is Mithra and Mithraism, which was an ancient Iranian deity that was brought into the empire by the Roman soldiers, Roman legionnaires. And they spread it all throughout the empire. And it appealed to them because it was, not only did it have all these other elements, but also because it had a real emphasis on ethical behavior and the virtues of courage and self-control. So this was one that became very important in the Roman Empire. Okay, so what people were in the first century Mediterranean world were involved in religious practices of some kind. Most of them were. That was the predominant part. There were some popular schools of philosophy. And I know my wife is going, oh no, now he's going to talk philosophy. Anyway, the philosophy had been around Athens for centuries. So, which is kind of the center, literally, of the empire. The Greco-Roman world tended to be more secular, even though the adherents often participated in civic religious practices, as everybody else did as a good citizen. But there were four main ones that I'm going to just mention briefly that had importance for this time. One of them, and I have a little memory crutch for these. You have the academy, the porch, the garden, and the walkway. And the academy was set up by Plato centuries before this, but it was still going on. He was the one that started the academy in Athens. He's a student of Socrates. He opposed the relativism and cynicism of most of the Greek philosophy at that time. By the time we get to where we are now, we're in what's called the Middle Platonism period. Now, it had shifted from Athens to Alexandria, but it becomes important, particularly later on in the first century and the second century, because it has a lot of the ideas that get brought into Gnosticism. That's really one of the sources of Gnosticism. And we aren't going to get into that. That's a whole other set of weeds to get into. The porch, or the stoa, harkens back to Zeno of Citium. He had a little group or school set up in what was called the painted porch or the painted stoa, in Athens. It was kind of across the way from the academy. And he held court there. His ideas weren't really systematized until about the 3rd century. But the tenets of Stoicism are interesting and important. God is a world soul. This is really a pantheistic idea more than a theistic idea. This is something that's unusual in the world at this time, this part of the world. The world state is composed of equal, free souls. There's a world state out there that's kind of on an ethereal level. They stress duty and self-sufficiency. They strongly believed in the providential nature of the universe in terms of fate. You're just fated for this to happen. It was very popular in the 1st century among the thinkers or the elite. The garden was literally a garden owned by Epicurus, which sat about halfway between the Stoa and the Academy in Athens. And Epicurus, who we get epicureanism from, their beliefs were an extreme materialism. They sought tranquility, and that's important to understand what that means. It means freedom from pain, disturbing passions, superstitious fears, including the fear of death. They believed they didn't really care whether there were gods, but if there were, they figured they had no interest or influence in the world. And they believed everything happened by chance. So this is also popular in the 1st century. Stoicism and Epicureanism were the two most prominent ones in the 1st century. Our contemporary use of words like Stoic and Epicurean seem at odds with one another, but they really had a couple things in common that are important. They shared some important ground, emphasis on rationality, both considered sensual pleasure secondary, contrary to our word Epicurean. Concerned with facing reality as they understood it, which gave them a very pragmatic character. And the biggest differences are really the providence and fate of Stoicism versus the chance of Epicureanism, and the emphasis on duty of Stoicism versus the moderate pleasure in Epicureanism. So, the final one is the walkway, which is goes back to Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, and it gets its name because he tended to walk around when he was lecturing. And it's really not important in the 1st century. It becomes important later on in Christianity. It's going to be, Aristotle will be rediscovered in the 12th century and really have a big influence on Christian theologians and philosophers at that time. But during this time, there are only two things that are really important from him. One was his book, Nicomachean Ethics, okay, and his book on rhetoric. All of those two things were foundational texts in any formal education in the 1st century. You didn't get a good education without learning something about Nicomachean ethics or something about rhetoric. Now, within the New Testament, that becomes important. We see the influences of the first one because it talked a lot about vice and virtue and being able to recognize truth. And actually those same themes are brought into the New Testament with vice and virtue lists that were common throughout the society, but they were uniquely Christian lists that Paul puts down. It's like Galatians 5, Ephesians 4, Colossians 3, all have these things. And rhetoric, which was the foundational text or handbook for the topic of composing oral or written arguments, is what it was about. Anyone of any kind of formal education would have had to learn this stuff. Paul's education undoubtedly included instruction in rhetorical forms. And you can see some of this in his very structured arguments, for example, in both Galatians and Colossians. So these were the stuff that was going on in the 1st century world. I think we got to take an intermission.